So great to have you all with us today for this launch event for our inspection report on education, training and employment services in youth offending services in England and Wales. It's great that we've had so much interest in this report. It was a joint thematic with Ofsted and Eston, its equivalent in Wales, and we're very grateful to them for their participation. Later this morning, you'll be hearing from Chris Pollitt, who was Ofsted's lead inspector on this thematic, and also from Alan Connick, who is Eston's lead inspector for this work. We're also very pleased to have had the assistance of User Voice in gathering the views of children on youth offending service caseloads, and we're joined by Hazel Scully from User Voice today. To start off with, though, I'll be saying a bit more about the methodology for this inspection, and Mike Ryan, the lead inspector for this thematic from the Probation Inspectorate, will take you through some of our key findings. Although, as you'll hear, there were some real areas of concern, we did also find some excellent practice and have been able to publish an effective practice guide alongside the inspection report. And Tammy Burrows, our head of effective practice, will take you through some highlights from that as well. Next slide, please. So firstly, a bit about the methodology for this thematic inspection. Fieldwork was conducted at the end of last year, at the end of 2021, and in January this year in 6 areas in England and Wales, and you can see them on the screen there. Many thanks to them for their help. I think we have colleagues from Bristol and Camden in the audience today. And we also ran a pilot for the methodology in Newcastle, and I think Gary Bell, the head of that service, is also in the audience, and again, my thanks to him. And we were particularly taken with Gary's Power BI data tool, which you'll be hearing a bit more about later this morning. The fieldwork and team included our own HMI probation inspectors, plus colleagues from Ofsted and in Conwy and Denbighshire from Eston. And we were also able to offer opportunities for temporary secondments to the inspection team from frontline youth offending staff, and it's great to have Carol Soverall in the audience from Hillingdon Youth Justice Service, who was one of those. And my thanks also to Mel Davis and Leon Bonos, who were the assistant inspectors on this thematic. Next slide. As with all of our HMI probation inspections, we drew on a very large range of data from both national data sources and from the fieldwork areas, and that enabled us to triangulate the key themes that came out of the review. And just to give you a sense of what was involved in the methodology, across the 6 fieldwork areas, we selected a sample of 181 cases from youth offending caseloads. 120 of those were court cases, 61 were out of court cases. The court cases were drawn from cases which had started supervision in the first 3 months of 2021. The out of court cases were from the summer of last year. The team also interviewed an extensive range of staff and managers and external partners. That included caseworkers, heads of service, management board members, specialist ETE leads within yachts, as well as senior leaders in health education, local authority, and forensic and educational psychologists and virtual head teachers. And again, my thanks to everyone who was interviewed for this piece of work. And in parallel with those interviews by Probation Inspectorate, colleagues from Ofsted and Eston interviewed staff and school and college leaders amongst local education providers in the fieldwork areas. We were also able to complete a national survey, which was sent to every youth offending service, and we had a good response rate, 68% responded. And we were able to ask them about the percentage of children on each of their caseloads who had special educational needs or on EHCP, or were NEET or receiving alternative provision, and the report includes the aggregate results from that survey. And finally, and very importantly, and in common with all of our reports, we commissioned User Voice to interview a sample of children on their view on the educational support they were getting. Next slide. You, I'm sure, won't be surprised to hear that a key finding was from our inspection was the huge levels of educational, psychological and welfare needs in the caseloads of the youth offending services we visited. Across our sample of 181 children, which we think is probably pretty representative of yacht caseloads in general, over a third had a disability, most commonly a learning or cognitive disability. 28% of the cases we inspected had an educational or healthcare plan. And I know Mike will say a bit more about this group where we had particular concerns. 65% of our sample of cases had been excluded from school at some point, of which just under half, or 31%, had been permanently excluded. Sorry, Kevin, are you able to advance to the next slide?
Oh, good.
So just carrying on through these bar charts. 26% of the sample had not been in any form of education, training or employment, and only 61 out of the 181 cases we looked at were in mainstream school or FE college. And we found that many of these children were only on very part-time tables or were attending only very sporadically. In every area, in fact, we found children who hadn't been to school for at least 2 years. And in one area, we found a case who hadn't been to school for 5 years. And finally, a quarter of the sample were looked after by the local authority at the time of our inspection. Next slide. And as our report shows, these rates of educational need or exclusion that we found in our sample were hugely higher than for the general population. The percentage of children on youth offending caseloads who are 16 or who are over 16 and not in educational training is 3 times as high in England as in the general population, in the yacht population, and the proportion who have an EHCP in our case sample was 5 times as high as for the general population of children. And the percentage of children on YOS caseloads who are in PRU or in some other form of alternative provision is 40 times as high as in the general population. Next slide. We were able to talk through user voice, to talk to a sample of nearly 30 children about what these experiences of exclusion or inadequate provision felt like, and we'll be publishing a separate report from them via our website shortly. But it showed, I think, a very mixed picture in terms of the feedback from these children. As you'll see from these quotes, for a significant number of children, their experience has been actually a very poor one. Many of them came from very challenging home backgrounds, had been in and out of care, and that had certainly made learning very difficult. A significant number had mental health problems or learning difficulties, some of which hadn't been assessed or adjusted for. And many of the children told User Voice that they didn't have an ETE plan and haven't been offered training or education options which they felt were really suitable for them. Next slide. Having said that, there were some youth offending service workers who were recognised by the children to be going above and beyond to make sure that they were getting the support that they needed. And there's some quotes on this slide, and we reflect those in our effective practice guides as well. So there were some children who were getting sufficiently flexible or personalised offer for their needs. Hazel, I've given a very brief summary there of our findings from your interviews. Was there anything else you wanted to add to that?
No, not a huge amount. I suppose just to reiterate exactly what you said, Justin. So the young people had complex needs, chaotic personal lives, and 10 of the 29 young people we spoke to, they had, neurodiverse conditions, learning difficulties, and mental health conditions. So almost all of these young people with these conditions felt that the ETE offer didn't fully cater to their needs. So say something like group work for somebody with ADHD, that was like, I just can't concentrate in groups and I've been excluded from school because of that. Or, say communication through an email for someone that maybe had dyslexia and found it difficult to read the emails. And I think, yeah, at an overall level outside of that, then, all the young people we spoke to, they kind of reported a lack of, choice and agency in the type of ETE that they took part in. So, very few had a plan, and they generally thought it would have been helpful, and, when they didn't have that choice, the ETE that they're offered or that say they were currently doing, that maybe it lacked a little bit of relevance to them and to their career aspirations, because most of the young people did actually have career aspirations. They just needed guidance on how to get there, or how to develop them, like any teenager. And then, yeah, so that the lack of relevance then, impacted their engagement and maybe then affected outcomes. But as Justin said as well, you know, on the other side, most actually did report positive outcomes. So they acquired soft skills, you know, better decision making, communication, you know, better behavior, better attendance. So there were these positives. Yeah, and this was largely due to a supportive yacht worker. So, you know, they did mention how nice their yacht worker was. You know, some reflected on kind of the extra lengths that they were going to support them, and you know, all of that support that they received. And then, you know, in certain cases, the yacht worker was considered to be basically directly responsible for the positive changes and the positive outcomes that they reported. So yeah, mixed bag, as you said, yeah.
Thanks, Hazel. So do look out for that report from User Voice when it comes out as well, and lots more interesting quotes in there as well. So that was a brief overview of the methodology. Now we'll move on to Mike Ryan, now the lead inspector for this semester, to talk about the key findings.
Okay, I'm going to go through these with a reasonable amount of pace. What I need to bear in mind, or what I'd like you to bear in mind, is that whilst we uncovered quite a lot of concerning and worrying issues in the field work, we simultaneously generated a lot of positive work, and we or identified a lot of positive work, and those are contained in, or the best of them are contained in the effective practice guide that Tommy will talk about in a few minutes. So the first issue that emerged was that children who had disabilities, who had identified disabilities, had in many senses the worst service. A third of those cases where disability was identified didn't have education provision that could sustain them in education. If you could move on, Kevin. So the next set of concerns are with children with an education, health and care plan. So where the local authority has agreed that additional support should be provided to the child where that's appropriate. We found that the service delivered was insufficient in almost half of the cases that we identified. So those with the most clearly identified needs in terms of education received the worst service. Okay, so we can move on, Kevin.
Come on, Kevin.
The extent of school exclusion in the OPT case load is very high, obviously. 2/3 of the children have been excluded from school at some point. We did find cases where there was an apparent disappearance from the education system of the children for considerable periods. The longest period we identified in the cases we looked at was 5 years, but it wasn't uncommon for a child to have been missing from education for a year or more, and we found 2 years absence in every area that we looked at. For those children where school exclusion had occurred, there was a marked difference between the assessment work that was undertaken and the rest of the children in the sample. That's really important because in order to get a grip of the situation, in order to get a grip of the situation, there obviously has to be an investment of time and expertise. Okay, can we move on, Kevin? We did find differences in the standard of work for particularly children of mixed heritage. That's consistent with other findings from our inspections, particularly the Black Boys inspection that was published earlier this year or at the end of last year. There was a poorer focus on the desistance of the child or getting the child to cease offending, and the ETE provision was less likely to meet the child's needs. However, to be clear, for other groups of children, there were no discernible differences that we could associate with ethnicity, other than for Asian and Asian British children who seemed to secure a better service from yachts than their counterparts. Could you move on, Kevin? For out-of-court disposal cases, we mention this because the yacht caseload is changing dramatically. The yachts are working more and more in a diversionary mode and have increasingly cases that are dealt with by way of out-of-court disposal rather than court disposal. Nonetheless, those children often have multiple and complex needs, and we particularly had concerns about the planning and reviewing of those cases in respect of ETE needs. The yacht is typically dealing with these children for quite a short period of time, but nonetheless, we would highlight the importance of high quality planning and reviewing with those children. Okay. Could you move on, Kevin? I need to explain these bar charts in the broadest sense. I would highlight the areas that we found in terms of what was achieved with the children, particularly in terms of improved behaviour and improved attendance at school. However, the concern that we have is that the attainment of qualifications or work towards level 2 in English and mathematics was very low. Very few children were attaining at the level that's required for simple entry into the job market. Okay, can you move on, Kevin? Lastly, or next to last in terms of findings, sorry, I've got lost in my parallel universe. We uncovered concerns about the rate of school exclusion of children working with yacht, that they were poorly understood, that the delivery of education through part-time timetables was worrying in the sense that this is supposed to be a short-term arrangement, and it often is a long-term arrangement. They're not appropriately reviewed, and the level of actual attendance is significantly below the level ostensibly scheduled as a part-time timetable. And there was a lack of clear process of review for children with either an EHCP in England or an individual learning plan in Wales, whether the child was of school age or over. And we had concerns about yacht's knowledge of attendance levels at college or training provision. Can you move on, Kevin? Thanks. What we did find in Newcastle was the use of a data analytical tool that combined social care data, education data, and yacht data, and was able to allow the yacht to drill down to any group or any individual which was contained within these multiple data sets. The screenshot there is an example of the range of interrogation that this is capable of providing, and it seems to provide a tremendous opportunity for yachts to understand much more clearly the information that is needed to understand the children's educational experience. Okay, so can we move on, Kevin? In terms of recommendations, there are a number of recommendations outlined in the report. particularly about the first one being for DFE and Welsh Government to consider how the unidentified and unmet needs of children who end up with yachts can be prevented through earlier specialist assessment, intervention and support. So can you move on, Kevin? We think the current measurement system that the Youth Justice Board employs is an insufficient tool to understand the education experience of children who are working with youth offending teams. We believe that there should be a more meaningful measure of performance that also includes the level of educational attainment being achieved by the children. Can you move on, Kevin? We also have a number of recommendations for yacht management boards, which include extensive monitoring and understanding of the actual experience of children in education, training and employment, so that yachts, we believe, should understand the extent of school exclusion, the actual level of attendance of children, the extent of additional support, and that every child with an EHCP or IDP has this reviewed. Okay, thank you. So that's a quick whiz through the findings and recommendations, and I'm now going to pass the baton over to my colleague Tammy, having stolen 2 of her minutes, and I do apologise for that.
No problem at all. I shall try my best to catch up. Brilliant. Thanks. Next slide, please, Kevin. Thanks. So from the fieldwork, we were able to collect numerous examples of where we saw our standards delivered well in practice. And from that, we've developed an effective practice guide to run alongside the thematic report. There were so many examples. It was fantastic. So it is quite a large document, but it is designed so that you can dip in and out of it. And you can do so using the contents page or the various subheadings throughout. So the structure of the guide is as shown here on the slide. There's an introduction, which is just an overview of the aim of the guide. And then there's a background, because we know that the guides are for a range of audiences, from people who've first come into yachts to those more experienced practitioners. So it starts off with looking at why ETE is so important for children subject to YOS oversight in terms of supporting that desistance. And then we look at the aims and expectations around ETE in this area as per the legislation for YOS. Then we give a summary of the statutory guidance for both England and Wales around education healthcare plans, additional learning needs and individual development plans, plus part-time timetables. The themes section identifies what we looked for and the expectations across the various domains that we speak of. We then share the effective practice case illustrations, both across the organisational delivery and case supervision. The last word is given to the children, where we share the barriers to ETE they identified during the interviews with user voice. And then we conclude with some overall key learning points from the fieldwork and offer a few additional resources in case people want to read up further about it. So if we go on to the next slide, thanks, Kevin. So looking specifically at the organisational delivery section in a bit more detail, these are some of the key takeaways that we found help deliver effective ETE work. And then we share some really illustrative examples from the services we inspected. So just to give you a bit of a whistle-stop tour, the Salford Yacht Board had a really clear vision and strategy that they'd set out, and that was really clearly delivered operationally. It was evident in the workforce there, who were a really committed body of staff. One of my favourite quotes, which I'm just going to read to make sure I get it right, is, "We are like Rottweilers. We battle and advocate and are tenacious in following this up on behalf of the children." That to me is really important. If you look at some of the things that Mike and Justin were saying earlier about the barriers that these children face, to feel like you've got someone in your corner backing you up like that will be so significant for the children. So really good one, and a great video from the Salford Yacht Board to share their vision. We then look at partnerships and services, and both Doncaster and Bristol speech and language therapists recorded videos talking about the impact of their roles. That to me really pulled on my heartstrings. When you think about how widespread the issue of speech and language and communication is, they're such an important asset. So I think the Bristol worker shared that when she reviewed the caseload, 70% of those on the YOS caseload had a speech, language and communication needs. And I think significantly from that, of those 70% of those children had never had assessments about their speech and language. So when you consider that, they've gone through all the other systems and no one spotted it, and it's waited till we got to the YOS where they've noted. So as a result of those assessments, those children can then better understand themselves and their communication style, but also the right support can be mobilised from a really informed place to ensure that the children can make the most out of their ETE. Next, we spoke to the information advice and guidance worker at Camden, and she spoke to us about the flexible paid work opportunities, which encourage children to explore vocational options. What I really liked about her is when we asked her how she supports the caseworkers refer, she kind of flipped it on its head and said, well, I don't support them, I get them to support me. So what that felt like then was that there was a real working alliance around the child, that it wasn't just the ETE worker over there and the caseworker over there, it was all of them working together, and they'd explore what's the best match for that child, what are the strengths, what are the opportunities, what are the concerns, and then they shared that with their prospective employers. Brilliant. Bristol Safer Options, we spoke to them about their whole system approach when they were looking at preventative work to minimise children's involvement in the criminal justice system. They very helpfully shared their terms of reference and their agenda. And they spoke about one of the projects arising from that was a weapons in school pathway. And from that, they had 100% of the referrals received an intervention or support. And as a result, there were 0 repeat behaviours and 0 exclusions. Then we look at enhanced case management approach, which I'm sure a lot of you will be aware of. But I think what was significant in the cases we saw was that it was psychologically informed approach, but the case formulation that had been done to understand the child and what was driving their behaviour wasn't just like a piece of paper that was done and stored in a file and put away. It was actively used, it was incorporated into the assessment, it was used in the planning, it was used to inform the intervention delivery. So really helpful for the child to mitigate some of the issues. There were so many partnerships and services, and we didn't have enough space to go into all of them. So Mike also lists a number of the others and gives a brief summary and shares the area they're from. So I'm sure that the areas wouldn't mind if you like the sound of it, if you want to give them a call and see what it's about. And then finally, we share the Power BI approach, the visualization of the data, which Mike spoke about earlier. So it's fine to steal my minutes because you were talking about my stuff. It's all good. Brilliant. So if we can go on to the next slide now, please, Kevin. Fabulous. So moving on to the case supervision bit, we found effective ETE work requires these key points, and we were able to find a range of examples of this being done. So we've got examples from school-age children and post-16 children, and again, to support you dip in and out of the examples, we've categorised them under the ASPIRE model, ASPIRE being assessment, planning, implementation, delivery and review. We also felt we had to add an extra section in around engagement, because we just found so many great examples of the strengths of relationship building, the tenacity and the care of the yacht workers. Again, if you look at in the context of what's being said earlier, that's really important. These children have you on their side. I haven't got a lot of time, but I'm just going to whiz you through a couple of examples just to give you a little taster of what's in the guide. So there's a child called Danny. Danny was subject to YOS when he was just about to transition to senior school, and he'd had some problems, he'd had some exclusions at the previous school, and during the assessment the worker just noted there was some communication issues, and she investigated it further, she explored it with the mum, And that yacht worker was absolutely instrumental in getting a timely SEN assessment and a plan in place, so that when he started school at the senior school, he was able to progress with a good plan that was communicated to everyone. So that's one of the examples, and I'll just give you a second one because it's such an important one to me. There was a child called Leo. Leo had ADHD. He'd got known adverse childhood experiences. He was subject to care, really difficult behaviour, but his yacht worker was really aware he needed boundaries. She was really strict with him. She'd got a trigger plan for him, so when his emotions started to escalate, he knew what he needed to do, and that included a timeout, and she made sure people followed it. That child, Leo, he had done a summer arts silver award, and he was determined he wanted to do a gold award. Now, a lot of the other people working with him didn't want him to do it because it was an equivalent to an A level, if I remember rightly. So they weren't sure he could cope, but the worker was adamant that he wanted to do it, and it was really important for him to do it. So she advocated a clear plan of how to support him for it. And he did it. He responded really well to the course. He participated in directing and producing a film that was given to first-time entrants in the YJS in the area. He was part of a group that presented to the CEO of Salford Council regarding their concerns about knife crime in the area. And Leo went on to achieve his gold. He then also achieved some AQAs, and he returned to education. And I think that's just so significant because that gives that child hope. It gives Leo agency. And a really poignant quote that stuck with me was the caseworker said Leo had said to her when he got that gold award, that was the best day of his life. So that, you know, this is really important stuff for people. Yeah, fantastic. I love the comment. Thank you. I've whetted your appetite there with a few of the case examples. I could go on for a long time, but I won't do so because I'll eat into everyone else's slots. Please go and explore the guide. There are lots of great examples in there. Also, please do give us feedback. Really interested in what you think, any areas for development, anything like that. So thank you very much. And we're now going over to Chris to look at the headlines from Ofsted. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Cami. I agree with the comments. It's quite inspiring to listen to those examples there, so thank you so much. My name's Chris Pollitt. I'm one of Her Majesty's inspectors, but also a specialist lead for SEND in Ofsted. And it was my privilege to work with HMIP on 5 of the 6 visits, the visits that took place in England. I just want to reiterate some of the messages that I've said before. From the perspective of looking at those 181 cases, there were some strong practice that we would identify from Ofsted in line with that high quality education. And so when I talk through the next few slides and talk about those areas where it was not as strong, it's just being mindful that actually there are some strong practice, but it's important to also identify these where it's not as strong. So Kevin, can we have the next slide, please? So in terms of those overriding phenomena of what we saw in those 81 cases, it was apparent that the greater majority of them were not accessing that high quality education, training or employment. Okay, and that was a phenomenon. I think Justin, Mike, Tammy have explained that quite clearly before, but it's actually when we talk about that high quality, it's that consistent education that meets their individual additional needs, but also provides that real ambition. And there's a high number of the young people that didn't have access to that. Okay, and I think for the reasons Mike mentioned in terms of part-time timetables, in terms of exclusions, as well, that was happening. So there was the phenomena there. We did see, and just to reiterate, in the conversations we had with the youth justice services, there was some real efforts and tenacity on behalf of those to work with schools, to work with colleges, and to work with different training providers to get these young people really accessing that highly ambitious way forwards. But the reality was, though, in spite of those efforts, for many of these young people, that access to those life-changing educational experiences remains some distance off. And it was mentioned earlier in the presentation. This is one of the clear aspects, and Tammy referred to it quite clearly there about young people whose needs were not being identified until they got to the point of being known to the Youth Justice Service. And for some young people, that was when they were 14, 15, 16, which meant they'd had over 10 years in an education system that hadn't identified such things as speech, language and communication need or specific learning differences. That actually, and what had happened is those quite complex special needs had been masked by challenging behaviour, which quite often had been resulted in either internal, formal or informal exclusions. Okay. The one thing that did come across, though, in all the 5 areas that I visited is those youth justice services knew what the weaknesses were. I don't think there was an area where I went to them and I said, are you aware of this? And yes, they were in all cases. There was very little that actually I shared with them that was news to them. And that actually, and what we could see in their actions and those engagements with educational providers, that there's a real effort to develop those relationships so they could get the best outcomes. Can we go on to the next slide, please, Kevin? So from our perspective then, from Ofsted's perspective, there's a series of recommendations we'd really urge youth offending services and youth justice services to really consider, because from Ofsted, and indeed I think from the whole partnership around this this thematic inspection, these were some of the determinants which were really challenging high quality education and therefore high quality access to the world and the life around these young people. We'd really urge those youth offending services to become actively involved in monitoring of those part-time timetables. Mike before said it beautifully. He said, these are only ever meant to be short term. But what we found is some cases these were going on for years, okay, and often not reviewed. Now, what was happening then in these cases, a part-time timetable would be established, and then when speaking to the providers, say, oh, we're really pleased because they're attending 75%. Well, that was 75% of a 50% part-time timetable, which actually is quite it's not an amount, it's not a reason for success and achievement. Okay, so we'd really urge those services to really engage with schools and challenge about those use of part-time timetables. And very similar to that was about unchallenged absence. Justin mentioned before about young people who'd been without a school or an educational setting for, in some periods, 1, 2, 3, 4, or even 5 years. Well, what we also found was sometimes there was young people with a named provision, but actually hadn't attended. And that actually that they hadn't been challenged, that provider, saying, well, what are you doing to get these young people through the door? What are you doing to keep them in school? So actually, we really encourage those youth justice services to challenge those schools to say, well, this young person's on your roll, why is it they're not attending? Particularly for those with special educational needs and or disabilities, and even more importantly for those with EHCPs. It's essential that they are there at all times as much as possible. The next aspect is off-rolling, and just for those colleagues who might be unfamiliar with this term, off-rolling is when a child is taking off the role of a school, college or setting, not in their best interest, but in the best interest of the setting themselves. It might be that their needs are too challenging, or they're not potentially going to become as successful as some of their other peers will be. We're also aware that there's some young people who, once they've become known to the Youth Justice Service, might actually come off the role of a school, particularly those who might have gone into custody and then coming out to find that they haven't got that school place as they were before. This was a phenomena that we saw during the 5 visits, and we'd really urge people to challenge this. Okay, if it's the case that that young person has come off the role of the school and it's not in their best interest, but in the best interest of the school, Ofsted would say that is off-rolling and therefore unlawful. The next thing is around further education and schools. What we did notice a lot of when we spoke with colleges is that young people with EHCP plans would often not complete that sustained period of time in further education. The college had not retained them for the whole time. And in some cases, when their attendance dropped, They were given very clear direction, the young person. If it doesn't improve in the next few weeks, okay, they will actually be asked to leave the course. Well, for a child with an EHCP, it's not as simple as that. They have a statutory right to access that provision. Okay, so we'd really urge, particularly for those of 16 to 19-year-olds, that if they've got an EHCP and if a college is named or a provider is named, they should be attending. And if they're not attending, it shouldn't be a case of you can't be there anymore. It should be a case of what can we do to make sure you're there. And then finally, unfortunately, this was a phenomenon we found quite a lot. And it was a case of young people being asked to go home, okay, without the necessary paperwork being followed. Okay, being asked to go home because they turned up in the morning and had a disagreement with a teacher, so the teacher had sent them home and said, come in tomorrow. Or in some cases, we found that actually sent home and then no communication from the school for 1 or 2 weeks. And it's in these cases where we would say that's an unofficial and therefore illegal exclusion. Okay, so on that basis, we would really ask the Youth Justice Services to challenge those educational providers when a young person has been sent home to make sure, is that registered as an exclusion, or is it just been sent home and therefore an unofficial exclusion? Those are the recommendations. I realised I've gone through it very, very fast, and I'm really sorry if I've gone over my 5 minutes, which I've no doubt I have. Okay, but I think it's my job to pass over now to Alan.
Thank you very much indeed, Chris. My name's Alan Connick. I'm an HMI with Estin, and I have lead responsibility for learning in the justice sector in Wales. And if we can move on to the next slide, please, then some of the findings that we identified in the visits that we undertook, myself and my colleague, Mamta Arnott, to the yacht in Conwy in Denbighshire. As other people have indicated, then caseloads there, young people there, were carrying with them a tangle of pathologies. And what we found there was that particularly helpful was the size of the caseloads that case managers were carrying. They were manageable caseloads, which gave them flexibility and which gave them the ability to respond to those instances where young people's predominant issues of the day rise to the surface. So they were able to address some of those priorities in order to help young people to continue to make progress. We saw that many of the young people who were of school age within the caseload actually improved their engagement in education during the period that they were involved with the YOS. And particularly, given what I've just said about caseloads being manageable, those case managers had the opportunity and the responsiveness to be able to address some of those issues when they came up in schools to enable young people to continue with their involvement. But also, we saw with many of the clients who have had to move schools, excuse me, the case managers were able to support those young people, support them in terms of their own feelings about having to move, but also in terms of advocating on their behalf, so that they were able to identify an appropriate school placement, and so that sometimes it was a case that the young people felt that it was being done for them rather than simply to them, and they were being moved around the schools like chess pieces. We saw several good examples of caseworkers addressing clients' needs holistically. And what that meant was that rather than focusing on perhaps a particular issue of attendance and dealing with it in any kind of punitive way, they were able to look at why an individual's attendance was suffering. That may be with school, it may be with work-based learning, to identify what the underlying issues were and to try to address those issues. So we saw in one case, for example, that a young person who wasn't attending school particularly well, they identified by talking to the young person, by talking to the family, that it was an issue, that the young person was struggling living at home, was spending time away from home, and so they were able to address those accommodation issues to enable the young person to have a firm base to work from. There were a number of issues, a number of examples that kind of followed that pattern, which meant that caseworkers were dealing with what was the priority for an individual, and by dealing with that, they could help them move on to the next priority if there was one, and the next priority. And we saw that as a very successful way of helping young people to continue to engage with the YOS and to continue to engage with education, training, and employment. I think everybody that we spoke to identified that literacy and numeracy skills for young people were important, that it was important to develop those as a skill, so that they had those skills as a stepping stone, which enabled them to cope better with education, training and employment. That was encouraging, but there was a downside to that, and that was at a strategic level. We found that there wasn't a clear strategy to ensure that there was appropriate and targeted support for those young people who actually needed to develop their literacy and numeracy skills. So whilst many saw them as important skills, if a young person didn't have appropriate levels of literacy and numeracy, then sometimes they weren't sure what to do about it. There wasn't a clear referral mechanism or signposting to enable the young person to actually go somewhere to develop those skills, and they didn't feel equipped themselves to be able to support young people in that way. If we move on to the next slide, then some of the recommendations and some of the issues that came out of the visits were, firstly, for in terms of educational assessment for the school age young people, then there were very good arrangements with the local authorities and with schools to gain assessment information. What that meant was that individuals knew what they were dealing with for a lot of the time. They actually understood young people's educational levels, young people's ability levels, and it enabled them to provide them with targeted advice and targeted support. That's not something that we see systematically across Wales, and certainly it is something that we would like to see all YOSs paying attention to. Soft skills are clearly very important because everybody talks about them. Everybody talks about, all the case managers talk about the fact that one of the most important issues that they're working with young people is developing their soft skills. And I think I've heard for many years now that soft skills are important, but they're very difficult to measure. And that, I think, that perception makes it really difficult for services to identify the particular interventions that are helping to develop young people's soft skills or wider social skills, things like self-confidence, self-esteem, etc. And I think while we don't have a way of measuring where people's soft skills are when they join, we have no way of being able to measure whether they are actually improving as a result of involvement with caseworkers or with YOSs. And I think what we saw that was encouraging in Connick and Denbighshire is that they had started to develop, not at a strategic level, but some people had started to work with a tool that was offering the potential to evaluate the impact of caseworkers' interventions in young people's development of soft skills. It was too early to identify how useful that was, but it was an example of something that may be worthwhile and which may actually start to help people to measure how effectively they are interacting with young people to develop those, what they identify as very important skills. ETE coordinators are very important, and there are certainly some YOSs in Wales who have been struggling along without ETE coordinators, and we saw in Connick in Denbighshire that these play a very important role in liaising with schools and with opportunity providers, and that can be to chase up assessment information. It can be to liaise with opportunity providers to help young people to make their next progression step. And here we saw some very effective links with the Working Wales team within Careers Wales. And because of the good partnership between those two organisations, we saw very flexible approaches taken by the Link Careers Advisor, which enabled the service to access hard to reach young people. In some cases, that Careers Advisor was going out to visit young people that caseworkers were struggling to follow up on, and going to their home, going to their place of work, going to some of the places that they were known to attend, because that individual had the flexibility to do that. With regard to the post-16 opportunities, we struggled a little because the service doesn't analyse well enough young people's abilities to succeed when progressing. And what that meant was that caseworkers were sometimes referring people into opportunities that we could see they didn't necessarily have the skills to be able to cope with. In some cases, they were setting them up with work-based learning providers at engagement level programs on the assumption that that individual would then progress into an apprenticeship. The difficulty was that that engagement level program wasn't going to lead to any qualifications. The individual didn't have qualifications. Often they had poor literacy skills, and therefore they weren't able to cope with, they weren't able to secure any kind of progression place into an apprenticeship. And what that meant was that we weren't able to track whether sending somebody off to these engagement programs was actually going to impact on their desistance, whether it was going to equip them to be able to cope with any further progression steps. And in many cases, young people simply returned to becoming unemployed. The data analysis that we saw, it was interesting to see some of the comments in relation to some of the other YOSs, but we saw a poor level of systematic analysis of data to look at how long young people remain on the unemployed register or the NEET register. So we may have some young people who were on that register who were NEET for a very long period of time. And rather than reporting to the YOS boards that there were 17 who were on the NEET register, it would have been useful to look at whether there were young people who were at those young people who were on there for prolonged periods of time to direct to direct efforts towards them to support them better. So inappropriate analysis of the data to monitor what happened to them. And particularly to pick up on those young people who I've already mentioned, who may have gone on to short-term fixes, short-term progression steps, which weren't actually going to lead anywhere. We weren't picking those up through the data analysis. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Alan. I mean, lots and lots for you to think about there, colleagues in the audience. I hope you've enjoyed those inputs. Do have a look at the full report and the full effective practice guide. And I know Zach has circulated a link to our website so that you can have a look at that. We've got some time for questions now, although the formal end time for the event was 12:30. I know that the panel can stay on for longer than that. So if you are wanting to ask questions, do get them coming in. Put your questions in the chat line or put your hand up and we'll come to you. Let me just start with a couple of people with their hands up. Caroline Akuku, I hope I've said your name right there.
Yeah, you have. Thanks for coming to me first. Hi, I'm the actual ETE worker at the Sutton Youth Offending team. And after watching that, I'm feeling quite, I don't know what the word is, but I want to go back to my partnerships, as in SEND, the education provider, which is Cognos, and just say, please listen to me. A lot of my agencies do listen to me, but I want to go back and really put forth that we have to work better together. So that's just a reflection on this. But I wanted to just get some advice. So our local PRU quite often sends young people home because of threatening and violent behaviour. And I noticed that it was said that they can't do this because it's not being registered and then there's no contact. And we have tried to challenge this, but they say we have to send so-and-so home because of the safety of the school community and the staff and the other students, and this person is scary and they're kicking off and all this sort of stuff. So then that young person is out in the community having a great time and they're not going to want to go back to school. And I just found it really interesting that we can go back to them and say, is this registered? And I just wanted to double check that that's the case, and I can do that.
Chris, I think that was the point you were making. Do you want to come in on that?
Yes, of course. So if no matter what the educational setting of a young person, if they're sent home because of a challenging incident or something which breaks their behaviour policy, it must be registered as an official exclusion, even in the case of an alternative provision. Okay, once they're sent home, then the school still has a statutory responsibility under safeguarding to keep contact with them, one, to provide suitable work, but also to make sure they're safe. And Caroline, in response to your question, to make sure they're not being criminally exploited during that time when they're away. So yes, definitely there is statutory guidance around exclusions on the DFE website. So I'd say that, so you're well within your right to go back and say it must be registered. Caroline, in order to develop things a bit further though, what I would strongly advise you in your questions to them, because first of all, exclusion by itself is not a bad thing. Sometimes it's a very viable option to do. But the next thing is, the key question is, what are they doing to prevent it happening again, particularly in the case of those PRUs and APs? So yes, Caroline, you're completely right. It must be recorded. Okay, they must keep contact with that child, and you've got every right to challenge them on that.
Thank you.
Thanks, Chris. Lots of yellow hands going up. Beverly Thor, did you have a question?
Or even Thor Beverly, I assume.
Sorry, it is Thor Beverly. I'm sorry, you must get that a lot.
I assure you I am male. I'm service manager of Devon Youth Justice Service. Now, you will know that the MOJ, unusually, not the YJB, circulated some new draft KPIs for Youth Justice Services 10 days ago, including a new one looking at ETE, based largely on the Welsh model. How much coordination has there been between yourselves and the MOJ? Because some people were quite worried about the way the MOJ KPI was going. It seemed to suggest that 18 hours a week was acceptable as opposed to the 25 hours that we've been sticking to up to now, for instance. Has there been any linking, or if there hasn't, could that happen?
Well, I think as Mike was saying, we do have a recommendation in our report. Although it's directed to the YJB, it's probably for Ministry of Justice to get involved in terms of deciding the KPIs and measures around this point, that there should be meaningful measures around ETE engagement. And I think you've gathered from this presentation the importance of really detailed and accurate data on levels of children's engagement and the type of engagement that they're getting. So we're certainly intending to continue to lobby the policy unit in the Ministry of Justice and the YJB on this point. I mean, you're quite right to say it should be a robust measure of full-time engagement. They should be getting a statutory entitlement to education that these children are entitled to, and YOP should be reporting on that, and that data should be published. So yeah, I mean, I think we're in the same place as you on how important it is to get that KPI right. I don't know whether Chris or Mike, you had anything to add on that.
Not from me, no. I think you've put it clearly there.
I can't helpfully supplement what you just said, no, Justin.
Thanks, Mike. Marius Frank.
Hello, colleagues. On assessment, a solution, a problem and a solution. I think the problem for many of the young people we're talking about is the academic nature of the way illiteracy and numeracy is assessed. through a hardening of the criteria for English and maths. And many of the young people struggle to demonstrate competencies against that assessment framework. But there are solutions, and one of the solutions is offered by Ofsted, which is creating curriculums with intent, implementation, and impact. And if you want to use a functional skill qualification or a portfolio-based one to demonstrate competencies for these young people, you can. I'd like your views on that. And also, while I'm on, I'd love to promote the Youth Justice Send Awards that I run in association with the Association of Youth Offending Team Managers. We've had great data and also fantastic progress in area partnerships using such a thing. But my main point is about regulated, if you like, statutory assessment. Thank you.
Thanks, Marius. Mike or Chris, do you want to say something about that? Mike, you had an interesting bar chart, didn't you, about the outcomes for children in the cases that we looked at?
Yeah, and so my response will be to defer to Chris's area of expertise in respect of this question, Justin. I think he's better placed to comment on how education is assessed. So over to you, Chris, I think.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Mike. Thank you, Justin. I'm in the process of responding to Henry's question on the chat. So if Marius will be good enough to pose the question one more time, I'll happily respond to it.
Of course. It's my problem is the way that the GCSE English and maths measure is beyond the capabilities of many of the young people we're talking about, whereas their competencies can be better expressed and celebrated, perhaps using portfolio type assessments and qualifications, functional skills type activity. Of course, that puts maybe a tension between what is accepted in terms of regular assessment and what these young people can do. But I was mentioning your wonderful intent, implementation and impact framework if a provider could demonstrate that an alternative qualification was working for that child.
Fantastic. Okay, thank you, Marius. What Ofsted's position will be on this is quite clear, is are those young people accessing the most ambitious pathways possible for that young person? Okay, that could be a standard of GCSEs. However, we are realistic. Now, in the case of where the cognitive ability of the young person is not at the point where they would be successful, the expectation would be then, well, what about those entry-level qualifications? Are those foundation functional qualifications that can help that young person get onto that next destination, be it onto college, be it onto employment or further training? So what I would say is where I think there's another question as well, Marius, with this that we would always ask schools is, what has the school done to actually assure themselves that GCSEs isn't an option for this young person? Is it because they haven't had the learning in the past, because they might have been excluded for long periods of time, or might have been on part-time timetables? But Ofsted's line is quite clear around this. What is the most ambitious possible pathway of learning for that young person? Okay, and if that's not GCSEs and it's functional levels or entry levels, then that is appropriate as well. Hopefully that answers your question, Marius.
Thanks, Chris. Alan, did you want to come in?
Yeah, thanks. I mean, I mentioned the issue in relation to the fact that YOSs aren't always assessing and measuring literacy and numeracy of young people. And I mean, as far as that's concerned, please don't assume that I was talking about GCSEs, because I wasn't. If we're not measuring the functional levels of literacy of these young people, then actually trying to identify whether we're helping them to advance is going to be impossible. And in those cases, often it's the assessment of their functional literacy that becomes more important. Very clearly, I would absolutely agree with Ofsted, as you'd expect me to, in relation to the importance of being able to allow young people to access GCSE activities, but it's the functional levels that we need to look at as well if we're going to identify whether they're progressing.
Thanks, Alan. I think I'll take a question from the chat line from Dawn Anderson, who says she wonders how many Youth Justice Services had a linked professionally qualified careers advisor or connections advisor or personal advisor attached to them, please. Mike, did you get some sense of that from the fieldwork areas?
All of the areas that we looked at had at least a link to a designated specialist information and advice and guidance provider.
And I think, as Tammy was flagging, Camden in particular, I think we were felt was doing some really interesting stuff in terms of linking people up to actual employers. The King's Cross initiative, for example, was something I think, Tammy, that we felt was well worth flagging.
Yeah, definitely, and I think it was the flexibility of the paid work opportunities with that one in particular.
Back to the hands. Dean Ryan. I hope it's not Ryan Dean. Dean Ryan.
No, it's Dean Ryan. Correct, first time. Thank you. Yeah, just I noticed a lot of the stuff that came up in the presentation was stuff that we really recognise, particularly the stuff about young people going through years of education with undiagnosed SEND needs and stuff, and we find that actually certainly when they do get assessments that the stuff about speech and language is picked up. I've got two questions really. One is that we see that actually we do a lot of work with colleges to sort of keep young people in ETE once they finish their orders and they're progressing, and that's working quite well. But one of the things that's becoming a real annoyance is that a lot of colleges are turning down our clientele because of the stuff they read in their EHCPs around offending behaviour, and they're coming back saying that they can't meet their needs. And I wonder if this is something that was common across the board, because actually what we've noticed is that when a young person has an EHCP and there's any sort of mention of that they've got offending behaviour on it, and particularly if there's offending behaviours related to knife crime or something like that, that colleges seem really, really risk averse, and we're having a lot of issues with young people getting turned away from colleges. So that's one question I wanted to sort of see if we could address. The other thing is that a lot of the young people who have got SEND needs say that they don't like large-scale institutions. They might want to go on to do courses like construction and other things which actually are taught in mainstream colleges, but because of their sort of adverse experiences of education in large settings, they want to have somewhere quieter, and there seems to be a real gap in provision, that there's not enough places that are a bit smaller and a bit more manageable for these young people, because actually a lot of young people going from not being in education to suddenly go to a building where there's hundreds of people milling around and really, really busy, it can just be totally overwhelming. And I just wondered if you can say something about how we address those needs.
So Mike and Chris, yeah, two questions from Dean. One is about the impact of children's offending behaviour on the willingness of education institutions to take them on, and how you get around that, and then a more personalised approach to children who've had bad experiences with school or college in the past, and whether that can help.
So in terms of the first question, we certainly found very positive examples where the issue was acknowledged between the yacht and the education provider, and additional support was provided for those children to support them to engage in the further education opportunity, and for the further educational provider to have a very clear person to link with. So that depends on the extent of liaison between the yacht worker and the service provider, and that's something that the yacht board needs to establish with the range of providers. So it is possible. We quite understand that this happens, but we did find examples of that being very clearly and actively managed, Ryan. So Dean. So the second issue concerning the paucity of arrangements for children who don't respond well to kind of mainstream opportunities, we have got a proposal or a recommendation to yacht boards that they take on the issue of developing alternative ways of providing training, and that they seek to develop more responsive, individualised ways, as we have the example of the King's Cross project, where children's needs are at the fore in terms of constructing the employment experience with them. So I don't know if that's helpful, but I think there are more possibilities that can be generated than perhaps currently exist.
Chris, the other Mike, did you want to come in?
So just very quickly to reiterate what Mike said there, in terms of going reverse order, we are aware that actually there's an inconsistent alternative provision landscape across the country. There's some areas where they offer phenomenal experiences for some of the reality you said, Dean, about smaller settings, access to vocational opportunities. We know there are other areas where that offer is not as broad. In terms of access to college, I completely agree with Mike. We're very aware of those situations where providers say we can't meet needs because this young person has been involved in gang culture, etc. I would question that very, very much, whether that's an appropriate decision on whether to say no to that young person. Okay. And actually, I think they'd be in a very, very difficult position to justify that legally if that's the only reason why they can't meet their needs.
Thanks, Chris. Couple more questions, people with their hands up. We'll take these and then we may have to wrap up. But Chris Parker, are you out there?
Yes, hi, welcome. I just had one of the slides early on talked about just educational sort of, quality amongst young people who were Black, Asian, ethnic minority. And it suggested that there was actually no evidence saying that the quality of education was different for those young people. I guess I'm questioning how you measure that, only because as a former educator, I know personally that Black and Asian, Spanish, all types of different ethnic minority kids learn differently. And they'll learn differently from different teachers. They'll learn differently because of their experience, internalized racism, or the communities they live in and biases and things like that. I guess I was just questioning, how was that measured in your research, or was that even measured? Because a lot of young people I work with who do fit that category sometimes feel as if the teachers that they're working with don't represent them, and they don't feel a connection. There's a bit more fear that they experience in these educational provisions. And that is a part of the reason why they don't attend. And some of their behavior, even their height, or their size, may be scary to some teachers who don't identify or understand that sort of demographic. So I was just wanting to get your insight on what you discovered in your research with that.
I think actually what the data was about, Chris, was about the quality of work being done by the YOS, by the Youth Offending Service, rather than necessarily by the school itself. So it was the quality of the assessment that the case manager was doing, or the planning that they were doing, or the advocacy they were doing to try and get the child back into school. And I think, Mike, we actually found that was worse for children of a mixed ethnic heritage. We didn't find a difference for Black children compared to the rest of the cohort, and actually for Asian children it was slightly better, I think, although the samples are quite small. So it was a sort of mixed picture, and it wasn't really looking at the teaching or the education quality. It was more about what the YOS workers were doing. Is that right, Mike?
Yeah, that's right. So when there's no challenge from here about the description that you gave of the experience of children from different backgrounds, but that we didn't look in detail at that education experience in that way. So.
And Chris, we did a previous thematic on the experience of Black and mixed heritage boys on YOS caseloads last year, where we found, as the national statistics show, very high, much disproportionately high rates of exclusion, for example, of Black boys from school, disproportionately represented in PRUs and alternative provisions. So, there's a massive issue out there which we've drawn attention to in our previous reports as well. I think this probably has to be the last question. Last hand up is Joy Malloy.
My question again is probably slightly beyond the scope of the research, but I was wondering, particularly from Tammy, if there was any good practice found in not necessarily direct work with children while they're in the youth offending service, but prevention or any initiatives that prevented that exclusion taking place for a larger cohort. Because obviously that places, so we have an issue with children who come in who are not in full-time education, training or employment. By the time they finish their intervention with us, they're often in a much better place. But actually, as a larger partnership, what we would want to see is those exclusions not taking place so routinely, etc. I wondered if you picked up anything really positive that on a preventative level.
There was the Bristol Safer Options, I think, was looking at preventative stuff, and there was a weapons in school pathway from that looked at it, and we do share some links from the Safer Options team. There was lots of examples of kind of planning going into stuff to prevent it. So there was a guy who really struggled in classroom, so they did some reparation work around building a shed. He couldn't read the instructions, but just looking at maths and engineering, he was able to figure it out and build a shed. And then from that, the sense of achievement and accomplishment from that, he was able to go, right, actually this is something I can do, and was given hope and was given a sense that he could do something, and then went on to do some other education. So there's things like that, but I can't think of any other wide scale things. But Mike, can you think of any others that we saw?
Yeah, Chris has just responded. There was the Deferred Exclusion scheme in Camden. That's worth looking at.
Yeah, I think, Joy, that would be well worth you getting in touch with Camden colleagues about. That was an interesting one as well that we found. Right, I think we probably need to wrap up. We've run over by a quarter of an hour, but it was well worth taking those questions. Thanks for all of your interest in today's event. I hope you found it useful. I hope you get a chance to read the full report. My thanks to all of our presenters today, to Mike and Chris and Hazel, Tammy and Alan. Thanks again to everyone who helped out with this thematic in terms of fieldbook areas and the inspection team. It was a great piece of work. I think you can see the level of interest in what we found and the commitment of the team to making sure that we hopefully get some action on the recommendations that we make. It's a crucial part of the life chances of the children on yacht caseloads that we really need to get right in the future. Thank you all for attending. I hope you've enjoyed it. Enjoy the rest of your days, everyone. Thanks.